Hello, hello. It is a Sunday afternoon and we are together again. Sorry, I just got really warm. Um, we're inside. It is, I don't know, it's gross to be outside right now. So we're going to do this inside, but I wanted to keep going with Frankenstein because I would like to finish this next Saturday on Halloween. The toads apparently are all gathered around to read too, which is awesome. I don't know how much they can hear through the glass, but apparently they like being on camera. So I don't know if you guys can see this little one. That is Freckles. Um, and then Bert is right here in the corner. They all have names based on their physical characteristics. I don't know if that's wrong, but that's how I tell them apart. Um, Charles thinks it's very funny because they don't respond to their names, but they all have names. They all look different. So it looks like Cheryl and Jason are here, which is awesome. I'm going to, there we go. I'm going to try to make this thing. Okay, good. 2 comments already. My gracious. Yeah, the Speckles is up here on the rock. And there is one more, the little brown one. I don't know where she is. I don't know how you sex a frog. So they kind of all just, I don't know. I say that the brown ones are females and the greens are males. And I don't know if that's right, but that's just what we're going to go with. So yeah, as I said, we're going to continue on with, yes, I know, it's silly, but they need to have names. They live in the house. We're going to continue on with Frankenstein, so hopefully we can finish this on Halloween. I don't know if Muncie is trick-or-treating. I haven't heard. So, yeah, you may see me in costume next week. I don't know what we're going to do for Halloween yet, at least during the day. I know what I'm doing Halloween night, and it's going to be super fun. So we will continue on with Frankenstein. I have my drink. So let's keep going. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Geneva. As I drew nearer home, grief and fear again overcame me. The darkened mountains appeared a vast and dim scene of evil, and I foresaw obscurely that I was destined to become the most wretched of human beings. Alas, I prophesied truly, and failed only in that in all the misery I imagined and dreaded, I did not conceive the 100th part of the anguish I was destined to endure. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat to arrive in Plain Palais. During this short voyage, I saw the lightnings playing on the summit of Mont Blanc in the most beautiful figures. The storm appeared to approach rapidly, and on landing I ascended a low hill that I might observe its progress. The heavens were clouded, and I soon felt the rain coming slowly in large drops, but its violence quickly increased. I quitted my seat and walked on, although the darkness and storm increased every minute, and the thunder burst with a terrific crash over my head. Vivid flashes of lightning dazzled my eyes, illuminating the lake, making it appear like a vast sheet of fire. While I watched the tempest, so beautiful yet terrific, I wandered on with a hasty step. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits, and I clasped my hands and exclaimed aloud, "William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this thy dirge." As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. What did he there? Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean against a tree for support. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost it in the gloom. Nothing in human shape could have destroyed that fair child. He was the murderer. I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was irresistible proof of the fact. I thought of pursuing the devil, but it would have been in vain, for another flash discovered him to me hanging among the rocks of the nearly perpendicular ascent of Mont Saleve, a hill that bounds Plain Palais on the south. He soon reached the summit and disappeared. I remained motionless. The thunder ceased, but the rain still continued, and the scene was enveloped in an impenetrable darkness. I revolved in my mind the events which I had until now sought to forget, the whole train of my progress towards the creation, the appearance of the work of my own hands alive at my bedside, its departure. 2 years had now nearly elapsed since the night on which he first received life, and was this his first crime? Alas! Had I turned loose into the world a depraved wretch whose delight was in carnage and misery? It was about 5 in the morning when I entered my father's house. I told the servants not to disturb the family, and went into the library to attend their usual hour of rising. I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father before my departure to Ingolstadt 4 years ago. I gazed on the picture of my sweet mother, which stood over the mantelpiece. Below this was a miniature of William. My tears flowed when I looked upon it. While I was thus engaged, Ernest entered. He expressed a sorrowful delight to see me. "Welcome, my dearest Victor," said he. "Ah, I wish you had come 3 months ago, and then you would have found us all joyous and delighted. You come to us now to share a misery which nothing can alleviate, yet your presence will, I hope, revive our father, who seems sinking under his misfortune, and you will induce poor Elizabeth to cease her vain and tormenting self-accusations. Poor William! He was our darling and our pride." Tears unrestrained fell from my brother's eyes. Before, I had only imagined the wretchedness of my desolated home. The reality came on me as a new and a not less terrible disaster. I tried to calm Ernest. I inquired more minutely concerning my father, and her I named my cousin. "She, most of all," said Ernest, "requires consolation. She accused herself of having caused the death of my brother, and that has made her very wretched. But since the murderer has been discovered—" "The murderer discovered? Good God, how can that be? Who would attempt to pursue him? One might as well try to take over the winds." "I do not know what you mean," replied my brother in accents of wonder. "But to us her discovery completes our misery. No one would have believed it at first, and even now Elizabeth will not be convinced, notwithstanding all the evidence. Indeed, who would credit that Justine Moritz, who is so amiable and fond of all the family, could suddenly become capable of so frightful, so appalling a crime?" "Justine Moritz! Poor girl, is she the accused? But it is wrongfully... Everyone knows that. No one believes it, surely, Ernest." "No one did at first, but several circumstances came out that have almost forced conviction upon us, and her own behavior has been so confused as to add to the evidence against her. But she will be tried today, and you will then hear all." Gentle, unfortunate, orphan Justine, whom my mother brought into our family when she was 12 years of age, there learned the duties of a servant, a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance, and a sacrifice of the dignity of a human being. She, who, in 7 years of faithful service, induced such great attachment from our family, and was the most grateful little creature in the world. She was now accused of the murder of the youngest in that family which she had so lovingly attended to. Ernest related that the morning on which the murder of poor William had been discovered, Justine had been taken ill and confined to her bed for several days. During this interval, one of the servants, happening to examine the apparel she had worn on the night of the murder, had discovered in her pocket the picture of my mother, which had been judged to be the temptation of the murderer. The servant instantly showed it to one of the others, who, without saying a word to any of the family, went to a magistrate, and upon their disposition Justine was apprehended. On being charged with the fact, the poor girl confirmed the suspicion in a great measure by her extreme confusion of manner. This was a strange tale, but it did not shake my faith, and I replied earnestly, "You are all mistaken. I know the murderer. Justine, poor, good Justine, is innocent." My father and the rest of the family being obliged to attend as witnesses, I accompanied them to the court. During the whole of this wretched mockery of justice I suffered living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of two of my fellow beings. One a smiling babe, full of innocence and joy, the other gazed on and unjustly execrated by thousands. The trial began, and after the advocate against her had stated the charge, several witnesses were called. Several strange facts combined against her, which might have staggered anyone who had not such proof of her innocence as I had. Justine was called on for her defense. Sometimes she struggled with her tears, but when she was desired to plead, she collected her powers and spoke in an audible, although variable voice. Concerning the picture she could give no account. Did the murderer place it there? I know of no opportunity afforded him for so doing. I believe that I have no enemy on earth, surely none who would have been so wicked as to destroy me wantonly. Several witnesses were called who had known her for many years, but fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward. When Elizabeth saw even this last resort about to fail the accused, although violently agitated, she desired permission to address the court. After berating the cowardice of Justine's pretended friends, she recounted the great affection and care with which Justine had nursed my mother in her last illness, and how warmly she was attached to the child who was now dead, and acted towards him like a most affectionate mother. As to the bauble on which the chief proof rested, if Justine had earnestly desired it, asserted Elizabeth, she should have willingly given it to her, so much did she esteem and value her. A murmur of approbation followed Elizabeth's simple and powerful appeal, but it was not to the favor of poor Justine. The public indignation was turned upon her with renewed violence, charging her with the blackest ingratitude. My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. I alone possessed absolute certainty of her innocence. I did not for a minute doubt the identity of the murderer. But what story had I to tell? A tale so utterly improbable. A being whom I myself had formed had murdered my brother, and in his hellish sport had betrayed the innocent Justine to death and ignominy. If any other had communicated such a relation to me, I should have looked upon it as the ravings of insanity. When I perceived that the popular voice and the countenances of the judges had already condemned my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony. The tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom and would not forego their hold. I passed a night of unmingled wretchedness. In the morning I went to the court. My throat and Lips were parched. I dared not ask the fatal question, but I was known, and the officer guessed the cause of my visit. The ballots had been thrown. They were all black. And Justine was condemned and sentenced to hang. From the tortures of my own heart, I turned to contemplate the deep and voiceless grief of my Elizabeth. This also was my doing, and my father's woe, and the desolation of that late so smiling home. All was the work of my thrice accursed hands. Ye weep, unhappy ones, but these are not your last tears. Again shall you raise the funeral wail, and the sound of your lamentations shall again and again be heard. Frankenstein, your son, your kinsman, your early much-loved friend, he who would spend each vital drop of blood for your sakes, who has no thought nor sense of joy except as it is mirrored also in your dear countenances. He bids you weep, to shed countless tears brought on by his own hands, creators of abominable life and horrific death. Thus spoke my prophetic soul, as, torn by remorse, horror, and despair, I beheld those I loved spend vain sorrow upon the graves of William and Justine, the first hapless victims to my unhallowed arts. It was about the middle of the month of August, nearly 2 months after the death of Justine, that the whirlwind passions of my soul led me to seek some relief from my intolerable sensations. My wanderings were directed toward the valley of Chamonix. I had visited it frequently during my boyhood. A tingling, long-lost sense of pleasure often came across me during this journey. Some turn in the road, some new object suddenly perceived and recognized, reminded me of light-hearted days of boyhood. The weight upon my The weight upon my spirit was sensibly lightened as I plunged yet deeper in the ravine of Arve. As I ascended higher, the valley assumed a more magnificent and astonishing character, rendered sublime by the mighty Alps, whose white and shining pyramids and domes towered above all. I was determined to proceed without a guide, for I was well acquainted with the path, and the presence of another would destroy the solitary grandeur of the scene. The ascent is precipitous, but the path is cut into continual and short windings, which enable you to surmount the perpendicularity of the mountain. It is a scene terrifically desolate. It was nearly noon when I arrived at the top of the ascent. A mist covered the sea of ice and the surrounding mountains. From the side where I stood, Montevert was exactly opposite at the distance of a league, and above it rose Mont Blanc in awful majesty. For some time I sat in a recess of the rock, gazing on this wonderful and stupendous scene. My heart, which was before sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance, advancing toward me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me. I perceived, as the shape came nearer, that it was the wretch whom I had created. Its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes. Rage and hatred at first deprived me of utterance. "Devil!" I suddenly exclaimed. "Do you dare approach me? And do you not fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Begone, foul insect, or rather stay, that I may trample you to dust. Oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered." "I expected this reception," said the demon. "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me. your creature, to whom you are bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You propose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. Abhorred monster! Fiend that you are, the tortures of hell are too mild a vengeance for your crimes. Wretched devil, you reproach me with your creation. Come on, then, that I may extinguish the spark which I so negligently bestowed. My rage was without bounds. I sprang on him, impelled by all the feelings which can arm one being against the existence of another. He easily eluded me and said, "Be calm. I entreat you to hear me, before you give vent to your hatred on my devoted head. Have I not suffered enough that you seek to increase my misery? Life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember, you have made me more powerful than yourself. But I will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to you. I am your creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if you will also perform your part, that which you owe me. O Frankenstein, remember that I am your creature. I ought to be your Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom you drive from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss from which I alone am excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature. Yet I ask you not to spare me. Listen to me, and then, if you can, and if you will, destroy the work of your hands. My tale is long and strange, and the temperature of this place is not fitting to your fine sensations. Come to the hut upon the mountain. The sun is yet high in the heavens, before it descends to hide itself beyond yon snowy precipices, and illuminate another world. You will have heard my story, and can decide. My heart was full. For the first time I felt what the duties of a creator toward his creature were. I weighed the various arguments that he had used, and determined at least to listen to his tale. He led the way across the ice. I followed. The air was cold, and as we ascended the opposite rock, the rain again began to descend. We entered the hut, the fiend with an air of exultation, I with a heavy heart and depressed spirits. But I consented to listen, and seating myself by the fire which my odious companion had lighted, he thus began. Yay. So, Cheryl, while we have just a second before we move to the next part, are you guys feeling okay today? Is there anything you need? Anything we can send your way? I hope you're feeling okay. This whole thing kind of worries me because it's different for everybody. So, we love you. We miss you guys. See, if you're living closer, I could like drop food off of your porch. But I can't. Kentucky's an awfully long drive. So, we will move on with what is officially in the book called Part 2. And this is going to be Frankenstein's, the monster's story in his own words. It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. All the events of that period appear confused and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time. And it was indeed a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my various senses. I walked, and, I believe, descended, and after quitting your apartment found that I could wander on at liberty. The night became more and more oppressive to me, and the heat wearying me as I walked, I sought a place where I could receive shade. This was the forest near Ingolstadt. I felt tormented by hunger and thirst. I ate some berries which I found hanging on the trees or lying on the ground, and I slaked my thirst at the brook. Before I had quitted your apartment, on a sensation of cold, I had covered myself with some clothes, but these were insufficient to secure me from the dews of night. I found a huge cloak, with which I enclosed myself and sat down upon the ground. I was a poor, frightened, miserable wretch. Innumerable sounds rung in my ears, and on all sides various scents saluted me. The only object that I could distinguish was the bright moon, and I fixed my eyes on that with pleasure. Then, lying down, I was overcome by sleep. It was morning when I awoke. I was delighted when I first discovered those pleasant sounds which proceeded from the throats of the little winged animals. I tried to imitate them, but was unable. Sometimes I wished to express my sensations in my own mode, but the uncouth and inarticulate sounds which broke from me frightened me into silence again. I determined to recommence my travels, and proceeded across the fields for several hours, until at sunset I arrived at a village. How miraculous did this appear! The huts, the neater cottages, and stately houses engaged my admiration by turns. The vegetables in the gardens, the milk and cheese that I saw placed at the windows of some of the cottages allured my appetite. One of the best of these I entered, but I had hardly placed my foot within the door before the children shrieked and one of the women fainted. The whole village was roused. Some fled, some attacked me until grievously bruised by stones and many other kinds of missile weapons. I escaped to the open country and fearfully took refuge in a low hovel, quite bare, and making a wretched appearance after the palaces I had beheld in the village. This hovel, however, joined a cottage of a neat and pleasant appearance, but after my late dearly bought experience, I dared not enter it. My place of refuge was constructed of wood, but so low that I could with difficulty sit upright in it. No wood, however, was placed on the earth, which formed the floor, but it was dry, and although the wind entered it by innumerable chinks, I found it an agreeable asylum from the snow and rain. I was about to procure myself a little water when I heard a step, and looking through a small chink I beheld a young creature with a pail on her head passing before my hovel. The girl was young and of gentle demeanor, unlike what I have since found cottagers and farmhouse servants to be. Yet she was meanly dressed, a coarse blue petticoat and a linen jacket being her only garb. Her fair hair was plaited, but not adorned. Her pail was partly filled with milk. As she walked along, a young man met her whose countenance expressed despondence. Uttering a few sounds with an air of melancholy, he took the pail from her head and bore it to the cottage himself. She followed, and they disappeared. Presently I saw the young man again, with some tools in his hand, cross the field behind the cottage. On examining my dwelling, I found that one part of the windows of the cottage had formerly occupied a part of it, but the panes had been filled up with wood. In one of these was a small and almost imperceptible chink, through which the eye could just penetrate. Through this crevice a small room was visible, whitewashed and clean, but very bare of furniture. In one corner near a small fire sat an old man, leaning his head on his hands in a disconsolate attitude. The young girl was occupied in arranging the cottage, but presently she took something out of a drawer, which employed her hands. She sat down beside the old man, who, taking up an instrument, began to play, and to produce sounds sweeter than the voice of the thrush or the nightingale. It was a lovely sight, even to me, poor wretch, who had never beheld aught beautiful before. The silver hair and benevolent countenance of the aged cottager won my reverence, while the gentle manners of the girl enticed my love. Soon the young man returned, bearing on his shoulders a load of wood. The girl met him at the door, helped to relieve him of his burden, and taking some of the fuel into the cottage, placed it on the fire. Then she and the youth went apart into a nook of the cottage, excuse me, and he showed her a large loaf and a piece of cheese. She seemed pleased, and went into the garden for some roots and plants, which she placed in water and then upon the fire. The old man had been pensive, but on the appearance of his companions he assumed a more cheerful air, and they sat down to eat. The meal was quickly dispatched. The young woman was again occupied in arranging the cottage, while the old man, whom I perceived to be blind, walked before the cottage in the sun, leaning on the arm of the youth. Nothing could exceed in beauty the contrast between these two excellent creatures. One had silver hairs and a countenance beaming with benevolence and love. The younger was slight and graceful in his figure, and his features were molded with the finest symmetry. That night I lay on some straw I had gathered, but I could not sleep. I thought of the occurrences of the day. What chiefly struck me was the gentle manners of these people, and I longed to join them. But I remembered too well the treatment I had suffered the night before from the barbarous villagers, and resolved, whatever course of conduct I might hereafter think it right to pursue, that for the present I would remain quietly in my hovel, watching, and endeavoring to discover the motives which influenced their actions. A considerable period elapsed before I discovered one of the causes of the uneasiness of this amiable family. It was poverty, which they suffered in a very distressing degree. Their nourishment consisted entirely of the vegetables of their garden, and the milk of one cow, which gave very little during the winters when its masters could scarcely procure food to support it. They often, I believe, suffered the pangs of hunger very poignantly, especially the two younger cottagers, for several times they placed food before the old man when they reserved none for themselves. This trait of kindness moved me sensibly. I had been accustomed during the night to steal a part of their store for my own consumption, but thenceforth I abstained, and satisfied myself with berries, nuts, and roots, which I gathered from a neighboring wood. I discovered also another means through which I was enabled to assist their labors. I found that the youth spent a great part of each day in collecting wood for the family fire, and during the night I often took his tools, the use of which I quickly discovered, and brought home firings sufficient for the consumption of several days. I remember the first time that I did this, the young woman, when she opened the door in the morning, appeared greatly astonished on seeing a great pile of wood on the outside. She uttered some words in a loud voice, and the youth joined her, who also expressed surprise. I observed with pleasure that he did not go to the forest that day, but spent it in repairing the cottage and cultivating the garden. By degrees I made a discovery of still greater moment. I found that these people possessed a method of communicating their experience and feelings to one another by articulate sounds. This was indeed a godlike science, and I ardently desired to become acquainted with it. By great application, after having remained during the space of several revolutions of the moon in my hovel, I discovered the names that were given to some of the most familiar objects of discourse. I learned and applied the words fire, milk, bread, and wood. I learned also the names of the cottagers themselves. The youth and his companion had each of them several names, but the old man had only one, which was father. The girl was called sister or Agatha, and the youth Felix, brother or son. I cannot describe the delight I felt when I learned the ideas appropriated to each of these sounds and was able to pronounce them. I admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, beauty, and delicate complexions, and how was I terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool. At first I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror, and when I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. Alas, I did not yet entirely know the fatal effects of this miserable deformity. My mode of life in my hovel was uniform. During the morning I attended the motions of the cottagers, and when they were dispersed in various occupations I slept. The remainder of the day was spent in observing my friends. When they had retired to rest, if there was any moon or the night was starlit, I went into the woods and collected my own food and fuel for the cottage. When I returned, as often as it was necessary, I cleared their path from the snow and performed those offices that I had seen done by Felix. These labors performed by an invisible hand greatly astonished them, and once or twice I heard them utter the words, "Good Spirit," and "Wonder." I looked upon the venerable blind father, the gentle Agatha, and the excellent Felix as superior beings who would be the arbiters of my future destiny. I formed in my imagination 1,000 pictures of presenting myself to them and the reception of me. I imagined that they would be disgusted, until by my gentle demeanor and conciliating words I should first win their favor and afterwards their love. The pleasant showers and genial warmth of spring greatly altered the aspect of the earth. The birds sang in more cheerful notes, and the leaves began to bud forth on the trees. It surprised me that what before was desert and gloomy should now bloom with the most beautiful flowers and verdure. My senses were gratified and refreshed by 1,000 scents of delight and 1,000 sights of beauty. I improved rapidly in the knowledge of language, so that in 2 months I began to comprehend most of the words uttered by my protectors. Every conversation of the cottagers now opened new wonders to me. I had heard of the difference of sexes and the birth and growth of children, how the father doted on the smiles of the infant, how all the life and cares of the mother were wrapped up in the precious charge, how the mind of youth expanded and gained knowledge of brother, sister, and all the various bonds between one human being and another. But where were my friends and relations? No father had watched my infant days. No mother had blessed me with smiles and caresses. From my earliest remembrance, I had been as I then was in height and proportion. I had never yet seen a being resembling me. What was I? A figure hideously deformed and loathsome, not of the same nature as man. I was more agile than they, and could subsist upon coarser diet. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded theirs. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster? A blot upon the earth, from which all men fled, and whom all men disowned? There were nights when, in place of the musical interludes, Felix would read to the others. By now I had improved sufficiently in my comprehension of language to share the unbounded listening pleasure this pastime afforded, and in addition to broadly increase my general education of the world beyond my forest. This reading had puzzled me extremely at first, but by degrees I conjectured that he found on the paper signs for speech which he understood. At the same time, I observed that while Felix was proficient in reading, Agatha was not, and he would often guide her efforts as she attempted to read from a charming collection of children's stories. This proved a great fortune for me, whereby I benefited by shared access to these lessons on the art of deciphering letters upon a page. To practice my skill, in the cottager's absence, I would borrow these little books, always careful to return them to their exact original locations. Later, I was drawn to more advanced works, dusty volumes which had perhaps been favorites of the old man before he lost his sight. These books produced in me an infinity of new images that elevated me above the wretched sphere of my own reflections to admire and love the heroes of past ages. But one narrative, Paradise Lost, excited different and far deeper emotions. I read it as a true history. It moved every feeling of wonder and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of exciting. I often referred to the several situations, as their similarity struck me, to my own. Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being in existence. But his state was far different from mine in every other aspect. He had come forth from the hands of God a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature. But I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose higher within me. Another circumstance strengthened and confirmed these feelings. Soon after my arrival in the hovel, I discovered some papers in the pocket of the dress which I had taken from your laboratory. At first I had neglected them, but now that I was able to decipher the characters in which they were written, I began to study them with diligence. It was your journal of the 4 months that preceded my creation. You minutely described in these papers every step you took in the progress of your work. You doubtless recollect these papers. Here they are. Everything is related in them which bears reference to my accursed origin. The minutest description of my odious and loathsome person is given in language which painted your own horrors and rendered mine indelible. I sickened as I read. "Accursed creature!" I exclaimed in agony. "Why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God in pity made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid even from the very resemblance. Satan had his companions, fellow devils, to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and abhorred. No Eve soothes my sorrows, nor shares my thoughts. I am alone." These were the reflections of my hours of despondency and solitude. But when I contemplated the virtues of the cottagers and their benevolent and amiable dispositions, my heart yearned to be known and loved by them. I dared not think that they would turn from me with disdain and horror. The poor that stopped at their door were never driven away. Could they turn from one, however monstrous, who solicited their compassion and friendship? I resolved not to despair, but in every way to fit myself for an interview with them which would decide my fate. I resolved many projects, but that on which I finally fixed was to enter the dwelling when the blind old man should be alone. The unnatural hideousness of my person should have no significance to him. My voice, although harsh, had nothing terrible in it. I thought, therefore, that if I could gain the goodwill and mediation of the old one, I might be tolerated by my younger protectors. One day, when the sun shone on the red leaves that strewed the ground and diffused cheerfulness, although it denied warmth, Agatha and Felix departed on a long country walk, and the old man at his own desire was left alone in the cottage. When his children had departed, He took up his guitar and played several mournful but sweet airs, more sweet and mournful than I'd ever heard him play before. At length, laying aside the instrument, he sat absorbed in reflection. My heart beat quick. This was the hour and moment of trial which would decide my hopes or realize my fears. All was silent in and around the cottage. It was an excellent opportunity. Yet when I proceeded to execute my plan, my limbs